Hello students, today we will see specific learning disabilities under which we have dyslexia, dyscalculia and dysgraphia. So in this chapter we will see in details of all this disorder, right from its introduction, definition, etymology, etiology, epidemiology, diagnosis and assessment, and prevention, prognosis and treatment as well. Let us first start with the definition of specific learning disabilities. The US government defines specific learning disability as a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or use of spoken or written language, which may be manifest as an inability to think, listen, speak, read, write or do mathematical calculations. While this definition include the conditions of perceptual handicaps, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction and developmental aphasia, it is not applicable to students whose learning problems are the result of visual, hearing or motor handicaps, mental retardation, emotional disturbance or environmental or cultural disadvantage. And as I have said, there are three major groupings of specific learning disabilities, which are reading or spelling, that is dyslexia, arithmetic, which is dyscalculia, and writing, which is also termed dysgraphia. And dyslexia has been around for a long time and has been defined in different ways. For example, in 1968, the World Federation of Neurologists defined dyslexia as a disorder in children who, despite conventional classroom experience, fail to attain the language skills of reading, writing and spelling in proportion with their intellectual capacities. And a definition of dyslexia, which is accepted by the National Institute of Health and by the International Dyslexia Association in 2002, says that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin, and it is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition, by poor spelling and decoding abilities. And these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is unexpected in relation to their cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. And the secondary consequences of dyslexia could include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. When dyslexia was identified, it was first identified by Oswald Burkhardt in 1881, but the term was coined in 1887 by Rudolf Berlin. He used the term to refer to a case of a young boy who had a severe impairment in learning to read and write in spite of showing typical intellectual and physical abilities in all other respects. In 1896, Pringle Morgan, a British physician, published a description of a reading specific learning disorder in a report to the British Medical Journal titled Congenital Word Blindness, in which he described the case of Percy, a 14-year-old boy who had not yet learned to read yet showed normal intelligence and was generally adept at activities typical of children his age. Looking at the prevalence of dyslexia, it is mostly found around 4 to 10% in the population, and it could appear in pure form, but frequently it is observed in combination with ADHD or DCD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or in combination with developmental coordination disorder. So, the co-occurrence of these two developmental disorder is termed comorbidity. And coming to see the etiology or the causes of dyslexia, it is caused by an impairment in the brain's ability to translate images received from the eyes or ears into understandable language. So, it does not result from hearing or vision problems, and it is not due to mental retardation, brain damage or a lack of intelligence. And it has been known for many years that poor reading ability tends to run in families, but now there is concrete evidence supporting that dyslexia is heritable, and population genetics suggest that there is as much as 50% probability of a boy becoming dyslexic if his father is a dyslexic, and 40% if his mother is dyslexic. And there is somewhat lower probability of a girl developing dyslexia in the same scenario. And results of large-scale twin studies suggest that both phonological and orthographic reading skills are significantly heritable. And at the molecular level, gene markers for dyslexia have been identified on chromosomes 6, 15 and 18, though the precise genetic mechanisms involved are not understood. There is one more study which has seen the brain imaging of dyslexics and normal readers while they are at the task of reading or processing phonological text. And researchers have found that in the regions of temporal cortex in the left hemisphere, there is underactivation in dyslexic than normal readers. And there was also found to be minor structural abnormalities in these brain regions of dyslexics. Though the causal significance of these findings remain uncertain, dyslexia can be caused by premature birth. Now let us see the assessment and diagnosis part of dyslexia. Dyslexia usually presents at about the age of 7 or 8 years when the child's difficulties become clear in the school setting, and the common signs of dyslexia include hesitant and inaccurate reading, need to reread materials to gain an understanding, difficulty with sequences, erratic spelling, reversal of letters, or dyslexia could also be due to auditory language problems or visual spatial problems, or inability to distinguish sounds or shapes on the pages. And further, it could even appear in association with poor spelling and handwriting and mathematical difficulties. Assessment is usually carried out by an educational psychologist, followed by a referral from a parent or a teacher, and standardized measures such as the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children are used to assess the general intellectual ability, and more specific tools, example the Dyslexia Early Screening Test for testing early years and the Dyslexia Screening Test and the Aston Index are used. The educational psychologist would then investigate if the child has problem understanding the meaning of the word, that is with the semantic difficulty, or whether he has problem with the phoneme segmentation, that is if he could see or hear the components and then put them together to create meaning and to spell the word. And according to the American Psychiatric Association, the diagnostic criteria for reading disorder, that's dyslexia, are as follows. Reading achievement as measured by individually administered standardized tests of reading accuracy or comprehension is found substantially below that expected given the person's chronological age, measured intelligence and age appropriate education. And the disturbance in criterion A should significantly interfere with academic achievement or activities of daily living that require reading skills. And if a sensory deficit is present, the reading difficulties should be in excess of those usually associated with it. And if a child meets all these criteria, then he is diagnosed as a dyslexic. Let us see the prognosis of dyslexia. The behavioral characteristics of dyslexia change across the lifespan. While reading problems are the key symptoms of dyslexia in the early school years, adults with a childhood history of dyslexia often become proficient readers, though most lack reading fluency and have difficulty decoding novel words, and few overcome the spelling problems. And moreover, adult dyslexic readers have persisting problem with phonological awareness, speeded naming and verbal short-term memory tasks. And at the other end of the age spectrum, preschool children at genetic risk of dyslexia show phonological difficulties in the context of slower than expected vocabulary development. Although some compensation can occur over time, dyslexia is usually persistent and can have a severe effect on academic achievement. And the effectiveness of treatment depends on when it is diagnosed. The earlier the intervention, the better the outcome. And with appropriate intervention, example speech and language therapy and teaching, affected child or an adult can achieve an adequate literacy level to function in society, although their reading abilities may still lag behind their peers. However, many people with dyslexia have good ability in lateral thinking and can shine in fields such as arts, creativity, and design and computing. Having now seen the etiology, epidemiology, assessment and diagnosis, let us now come to the intervention part of dyslexia. It helps to identify dyslexia as early in life as possible. Adults with unidentified dyslexia often work in jobs that are below their intellectual capacity, but with help from a tutor, a teacher or a professional, almost all people with dyslexia can become good readers and writers, and the following strategies could be used to help them make progress. They could be exposed to early oral reading, writing, drawing practice to encourage development of print knowledge, basic letter formation, recognition skills and linguistic awareness, and they could even be made to practice reading different kinds of texts like magazines, books, comics and ads. A multi-sensory approach could be adapted with them, where they could be asked to use sight, sound and touch. They could be encouraged to use form the letter in the air while reading out the letter, and some modifications could be done in their classroom setting. They might be given some extra time to complete assignments, help with note taking or oral testing and some other means of assessment. And these children could also be encouraged to use computer than write in a book. They could even be given the additional benefit of using spell checker. Computer software programs are available to teach phonemic recognition that could provide effective adjuncts to tutoring and classroom intervention. They could even be encouraged to use books on tape and assistive technology, for example, screen readers and voice recognition computer software. And providing supportive home and school environments is essential. Parents and teachers should be strongly encouraged to praise and support the child. They should be encouraged to use the sound the letter presents so that the child gradually connects the visual pattern of words to the auditory pattern of sounds. They could be taken to regular eye check to rule out any problems that could be associated with their vision. Therefore, a number of strategies could be used to help dyslexic overcome their problem or reduce their problem to some extent and lead a healthy and better life. Let us now see dyscalculia. Dyscalculia refers to a wide range of lifelong learning disabilities involving math. There is no single type of math disabilities, so dyscalculia can vary from person to person and it can affect people differently at different stages of life. And mathematical learning disorder, also known as dyscalculia, is a term used for a wide range of disorders caused by abnormalities in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or use of math. Several manifestations of the disorder may occur throughout the life of the individual. And mathematical learning disorder does not include children who have problems caused primarily by visual, hearing or motor impairments, mental retardation, emotional disturbance or environmental, cultural or economic disadvantages. And mental disabilities specific to mathematics were originally identified in case studies with patients who suffered specific arithmetic disabilities as a result of damage to specific regions of the brain. More commonly, dyscalculia occurs developmentally as a genetically linked learning disability which affects a person's ability to understand, remember or manipulate numbers or number facts. And the term is often used to refer specifically to the inability to perform arithmetic operations, but is also defined by some educational professionals and cognitive psychologists as a more fundamental inability to conceptualize numbers as abstract concepts of comparative quantities, which these researchers consider to be a foundational skill upon which other mathematical abilities build. Etymology, how the term dyscalculia has come to. The term dates back to at least 1949. It comes from Greek and Latin, which means counting badly. The prefix dys comes from Greek, which means badly, and calculia comes from the Latin calculare, which means to count. And disabilities involving math vary greatly, as I already said. So, the effects they have on person also vary. For instance, a person who has trouble processing language will face different challenges in math than a person who has trouble with visual spatial relationships. For individuals with visual spatial trouble, it may be hard to visualize patterns of different parts of a math problem, whereas language processing problems may make it hard for a person to get a grasp of the vocabulary involved in math. So, without the proper vocabulary and a clear understanding of what the words represent, it is difficult to build on math knowledge. If we see the prevalence of dyscalculia in the population, it is found generally around 6 to 7% of elementary school children. However, children often have more than one disorder. 56% of children with a reading disorder also showed poor mathematics achievement, and 43% of children with a mathematical learning disorder has shown poor reading skills. Therefore, the estimated incidence may not accurately reflect the presence of the disorder. Some children may have narrow deficits in certain aspects of arithmetic, example counting, and perform well in other aspects. However, standardized tests will still record a poor performance. Scientists have tried to find the causes behind dyscalculia. They have associated dyscalculia with lesions in brain such as the Brodmann area and the angular gyrus at the junction between the temporal and parietal lobes of the cerebral cortex. And they have also found a deficit in working memory. Adams and Hitch argue that working memory is a major factor in mental addition. From this case, Geary conducted a study that suggested there was a working memory deficit for those who suffered from dyscalculia. Short-term memory being disturbed or reduced could also make it difficult to remember calculations, and the cause could also be hereditary. Therefore, we could say that there are two major areas of weakness that contribute to math learning disabilities, that involves visual spatial difficulties which result in a person having trouble processing what the eye sees, and language processing difficulties which result in a person having trouble processing and making sense of what the ear hears. Let us now see the assessment part of dyscalculia, how it is assessed and diagnosed. Having trouble with learning math skills does not necessarily mean that a person has a learning disability. All students learn at different paces, so it can take a young student time and practice for formal math procedures to make practical sense. So, if a person has to be assessed, we could look for following signs as DSM-4 has given the criteria. That is, first, the mathematical ability as measured by the individually administered standardized test should be substantially below that expected given the person's chronological age, measured intelligence, and age appropriate education. And second, the disturbance in criterion A should significantly interfere with the academic achievements and or daily living that require mathematical ability. And if a sensory deficit is present, the difficulties in mathematical ability are in excess of those usually associated with it. So, if a child or an adult meets the criteria described in DSM-4 TR, then he would be diagnosed for dyscalculia. So, having diagnosed dyscalculia, what are the different interventions that a person, that psychologist could adapt is they could use software that's been intended to remediate dyscalculia. They could use forms of educational therapy such as neurosensory educational therapy that can be an effective treatment, and a study has used transcranial direct current stimulation to the parietal lobe during numerical learning, and it has demonstrated that selective improvement of numerical abilities was present even after 6 months. So, helping a student identify his or her strengths and weaknesses could be the first step in getting help, and following identification, parents, teachers, other educators can work together to establish strategies that will help the student learn math more effectively. So, work on finding different ways to approach math facts. Example, instead of just memorizing the multiplication tables, they could be explained that 8 into 2 equals to 16. So, if 16 is doubled, it will give 8 into 4 equals to 32. And they could be introduced new skills beginning with concrete examples, later moving on to more abstract applications. And once students become aware of their strengths and weaknesses, understanding how a person learns best is the best and big step in achieving academic success and confidence. Therefore, a number of interventions could be used with people who have been diagnosed with dyscalculia. Now, let us move on to see dysgraphia, which is a learning disability that affects writing, which requires a complex set of motor and information processing skills. Dysgraphia makes the act of writing difficult. It can lead to problems with spelling, poor handwriting, putting words on the page, etc. And people with dysgraphia can have trouble organizing letters, numbers and words on a line or page. And this can partly result from, as I have already said, this problem could also result from visual spatial relationships, that is trouble processing what the eye sees, or from language processing difficulty, that is in trouble processing and making sense of what the ear hears. And as with all learning disabilities, dysgraphia is a lifelong challenge, although how it manifests may change over time. A student with this disorder can benefit from specific accommodations in the learning environment, and the word comes from Greek word dys, meaning impaired, and graphia, meaning making letter forms by hand. So, impaired letter forms by hand. And there are two stages in the act of writing. One is the linguistic stage and the other is motor expressive praxic stage. The linguistic stage involves the encoding of auditory and visual information into symbols for letters and written words. This is mediated through angular gyrus. The angular gyrus provides the linguistic rules which guide writing. And the motor stage is where the expression of written words or graphemes is articulated. This stage is mediated by Exner's writing area of the frontal lobe. And people with dysgraphia can often write on some level, but they may lack other fine motor skills. For example, they may find tasks such as tying shoes difficult, but it does not mean that they have difficulties in all fine motor skills. And people with dysgraphia often have unusual difficulty with handwriting and spelling, as I have said, which in turn can cause writing fatigue. They may lack basic grammar, spelling skills. For example, they might have difficulties in writing the letter P, Q, B and D, and they might often write the wrong word when trying to formulate their thoughts. And the disorder generally emerges when the child is first introduced to writing. Dysgraphia is a biologically based disorder with genetic and brain basis. More specifically, we could say it's a working memory problem. In dysgraphia, individuals fail to develop normal connections among different brain regions needed for writing. People with dysgraphia have difficulty in automatically remembering and mastering the sequences of steps involved in writing, and it's also in part due to underlying problems in orthographic coding, orthographic loop and graphomotor outputs. That's the movement that results in writing by one's hand, finger and executive functions involved in letter writing. The orthographic loop is when written words are stored in the mind's eye, connected through sequential movements for motor output through the hand, which is nothing but remembering what the word is and putting it on the paper, the movement involved in writing that word. Now, let us see how dysgraphia could be assessed and diagnosed. There are number of signs through which we could understand whether a person might have dysgraphia. We could see the cramping of fingers while writing short entries, odd dressed arm, body or paper orientations, such as creating an L with the arm, and there could be mixed uppercase and lowercase letters, inconsistent form and size of letters or unfinished letters. There could be misuse of lines and margins, inefficient speed of copying, inattentiveness over details when writing, or frequent need of verbal cues, referring heavily on vision to write. Of course, they would also have poor legibility. Handwriting abilities may interfere with spelling and written composition, and they might have a hard time translating ideas to writing. Sometimes using the words may also cause them pain. So, as with all other disorders, DSM describes dysgraphia as a learning disability in which one's writing skills are below those expected given a person's age measured through intelligence and age appropriate education. And if this criteria significantly interferes with their academic achievement and daily living, then we could say that the person has dysgraphia. And if a sensory deficit is present, then the problem should be more than what we could associate with that sensory deficit. So, after the diagnosis of dysgraphia is made, we can decide on what treatment could be given depending on the child's or the adult's situation. Treatment for dysgraphia varies and may include treatment for motor disorders to help control movements, writing movements specifically, and the use of educational therapy can be effective in the classroom as long as teachers are well informed about dysgraphia. Other treatments may address impaired memory or other neurological problems. Some physicians recommend the individuals with dysgraphia to use computer to avoid problems in handwriting, and dysgraphia can be overcome with appropriate and conscious effort and training. The International Dyslexia Association suggests the use of kinesthetic memory through early writing by having the child overlearn how to write letters and to later practice writing with their eyes closed or averted to reinforce the feel of the letters being written. Therefore, and they could also be suggested to use cursive writing as it has fewer reversible letters and can also help lessen spacing problems, at least within words, because cursive writings are generally attached within a word. Therefore, a number of strategies could be used with people affected with dysgraphia to overcome their problems, or at least to reduce it to an extent. So, in this chapter we have seen in detail of all the learning disabilities. I hope it gives you a clear understanding of all the learning disabilities. Thank you.